Welcome to Cattle Connect, your insight into Alabama's beef cattle industry. I'm your host, Josie Jones, and this is Cattle Connect, brought to you by the Alabama Cattlemen's Association. Hello, cattlemen. Welcome back to the Cattle Connect podcast. We're very excited to be talking with all of you today as we are quickly approaching fall. It's just around the corner, and with that, we've thankfully had some better weather here across the state over the past couple of weeks. So really enjoying some cooler weather and also getting to spend a little bit more time with our families. Hopefully you've had the same here recently and are slowing down a little bit on the farm. I know normally when most of you hear my voice, I'm talking about all things beef promotion, youth education, or the checkoff in general. But today we're going to change that up a little bit. We have plenty of time to talk about those things as we approach October Beef Month and all of the promotions happening there. But I wanted to do a little bit of education with our producers specifically today. So one thing that most of you probably don't know about me is I come from a family full of medical professionals and first responders. So this is definitely a topic that is near and dear to my heart and something that I think our producers need to remember and kind of keep in the back of their mind as they're working on the farm day in and day out. Today, our main topic is going to be all things safety on the farm and emergency medical response in rural Alabama. Now, obviously, I work in communications, so this is not necessarily my normal topic. So today I've brought in a professional to help us go over all of these things and help you know what you need to be prepared for on your operation in case one of these worst case scenarios ever do happen. So Jackson Chance is in studio today to give that expert opinion. Jackson is a registered nurse. He's the assistant fire chief in his community, an EMS director, and a first responder. He's been working in rural Alabama communities for several years now, and his passion lies in providing resources to improve the quality of life of those living in those areas. Welcome on, Jackson.
Thanks for having me.
Before we jump into today's topic and all the things our producers need to know, I always have our guests tell a little bit about themselves and kind of your backstory so that they know where they're getting information from. Can you tell us a little bit about you and your background in emergency response?
Sure. So I grew up in a rural area. I joined the volunteer fire department when I was 15 as a junior firefighter. I finished up my EMT license the month I turned 18 and tested for that and started nursing school. I went through and completed my RN and then finished up paramedic school after that. I spent the last right at 10 years, the majority of it either in the back of an ambulance, the back of a helicopter, a fire truck, or in an emergency room.
Jackson has seen just about every side of these emergency situations, whether that's being the first set of boots on the ground, responding out to various operations, to the person, as he mentioned, in the back of the ambulance, transporting them, or the nurse on the other side catching that patient and helping them get the care that they need in the hospital. So I think he's a great voice to talk about all of the things that you need to be prepared for and then how to handle that situation if you ever are kind of dealing with that, whether it's you or a family member or a friend. Jackson's also been involved in several other ways in the community. He's done some diving as well in different areas, so he's dealt with some water-related emergencies, and then also done some stuff in cases of natural disasters. Additionally, as if your schedule wasn't busy enough, you now have a new addition to your family who's keeping you on your toes, your sweet little daughter.
Yep, Katie and I had our first daughter, Everly. She just turned 14 months, and she's running around the house now causing trouble, so she keeps us busy.
She definitely does. I saw a picture of her the other day climbing up on top of a desk, so she definitely has your love for adventure and kind of getting into all the things. I guess it's coming back around for you.
Absolutely.
Well, now that our listeners have learned a little bit more about your background, let's get into the meat of the matter and do some farm life education. We all know that accidents happen, and it's one of the biggest concerns that we have with farming operations. Unfortunately, with this occupation, there just come more hazards, whether that's dealing with the different equipment that we use or kind of the variables when it comes to dealing with livestock or even the land itself. And on top of all of this, we also know that this role in producing food for America tends to put more stress on our bodies. So you just deal with more illnesses and things like that. So there are definitely a lot of different areas of this to cover. On top of all of this, we also know that our cattle producers tend to live in areas further from development, which can mean getting emergency response or medical care can be a little bit more difficult. While we love our rural communities, this just is a downside of living in those areas. And so sometimes it takes a little bit longer to have somebody out. So today we're going to talk about how people can be a little bit more prepared in case they ever find themselves in one of these situations or to help somebody else who's in that situation. So what are some of the initial things that you can share about response to these rural areas in Alabama, having worked in them yourself?
I think the biggest thing is, as you mentioned, being from a rural area, I see this all the time. responders aren't that close by. It's going to take them time to get there. You might have the best emergency response agency in the area, but if you're in a rural area, it's just spread out. They can't get there as quickly. So knowing what to do on your own for those first few minutes might make the difference between surviving or not surviving an injury. In addition, those out in rural areas might tend to engage in more hazardous activities, whether that involves a tractor, an ATV, side-by-side, even just manual labor is obviously, it puts you at more risk for injury. So, like I said, knowing what to do in those first few minutes, and also knowing some things you can do to avoid those injuries or make them not as severe can really make a big difference.
Saddle up your buckaroos and bring them down to the museum. Located just 2 blocks from the state capitol, the museum provides fun and learning all in one stop as visitors explore Alabama's beef cattle industry. Learn more at bamabeef.org/themuseum.
So let's talk a little bit about what producers can do. Obviously, they know they live in rural areas and they need to be prepared, but sometimes it can be a little bit daunting to approach that task, not being someone who's involved in this on a daily basis. So can you talk about some of the things that they can do as we head into kind of the off season for farming to prepare their operations to be a little bit more ready if something ever does happen?
Right. I think the two biggest things for anyone to keep in mind or that they can do to prepare would be, one, to take a CPR class. I think everyone should know CPR. They've addressed it in the high schools. They're starting to teach a lot of high schoolers CPR before they graduate. But I think everyone should take a CPR class and be comfortable doing CPR. Another big part of that is not being afraid to do CPR. And we can talk a little bit about, what CPR is, what we would use it for. If you have someone that goes into sudden cardiac arrest, their heart stops beating or is not beating correctly, you've only got about 10 minutes before they become brain dead. They don't have any chance of survival. They say in the first 10 minutes, for each minute that you don't do CPR, you have a 10% decrease in survival. And the AHA says that having a bystander do CPR before EMS arrives increases your chance of survival by up to 40%.
Wow.
So what does CPR do? I think everyone's seen movies or seen TV shows where they're doing chest compressions or maybe even mouth-to-mouth. And learning how to do that, the really important part of that is chest compressions. What does that do? If your heart stops, the chest compressions help to circulate blood, to get oxygen to your brain, your kidneys, all of your organs, to keep them alive long enough to get your heart restarted. And a big thing that I'd like to mention, because I see this a lot in rural areas, people will start CPR, and then the person doesn't wake up. And so they stop doing it until EMS gets there. The purpose of doing CPR is just to keep oxygen going to their brain long enough for EMS to get there and then give them the drugs or use the machines to help get their heart restarted. So it's really important that once you start CPR, you don't stop until someone arrives. Even if it takes a long time to get there, even if it's 20, 30, 40 minutes before an ambulance arrives, you've got to keep doing that to keep oxygen going to their brain. If you're doing CPR, they can survive a long time without a heartbeat, but you've got to be doing CPR, or when EMS arrives, there won't be anything left to get back.
Can you really quickly, before we move on, go over what someone would do to decide whether or not to start CPR? What are the things that they need to check to make that decision of, hey, I need to start CPR while we're calling 911?
Right. So the biggest thing you just mentioned is always call 911 for help. I know a lot of places don't have good phone service. If you are somewhere you can get in touch with 911, though, they'll actually talk you through the steps. I'll give a brief overview of it, but it's really important to call them and get help on the way. And then also, if you forget something I mentioned or you decide not to take the CPR class, they can still talk you through doing it. So if someone collapses and goes unconscious and you're going to check for a pulse, I think most people probably know how to check for a pulse. 2 fingers on the side of the neck, and you're just going to feel for a pulse for up to 10 seconds. And if you don't feel one, and if they're not breathing, that's the other thing. If you see someone's not breathing or they're unresponsive and they're gasping, even if they're gasping, you still want to start CPR if they're unresponsive and they don't have a pulse and they're either not breathing or not breathing normally. And then you just put both hands in the center of their chest, basically on their sternum, and you're going to try and push hard and fast. The official rate is 100 to 120 per minute, and you're trying to push at least 2 inches deep. And it's really hard to do, so you're not actually going to hurt them. A lot of people worry about, am I going to hurt the person more by doing CPR? If you don't do CPR, 100% chance they're going to die. So even if you do cause a small chest injury or even possibly crack a rib, although that's unusual, it's a lot better to do that than not give them any chance at all.
You're running the risk of you really have nothing to lose by trying it.
Exactly.
But that's something that a lot of people are scared to do.
Correct. And I think the big thing is, like I mentioned, if someone has to leave to call 911, if at all possible, get back to do CPR or leave someone there to do CPR in the meantime, just because Every second counts when it comes to that. And then do not stop CPR until someone gets there to take over for you, even if it's a long time.
So that's all things on the front of CPR. What is another thing that you would suggest to be prepared for in these cases if a person is still alive and still breathing, but maybe has encountered, an injury or something like that?
Right. So the leading cause of preventable trauma deaths in the United States, now this is things that we can actually make a difference for, is bleeding to death. I mean, that's, if you think about all the things on a farm that could cause you to bleed, you got everything from mowers, PTO shafts. We mentioned side-by-sides. We had a really bad side-by-side accident recently the patient almost bled to death from. It's knowing how to stop that. I'm not talking about, I've cut my finger, brushed up against a fence, I've got a small bleed, that's not, I'm talking about people that are actually severely injured or severely cut, and they're losing enough blood that could actually kill them. A lot of first aid classes talk about the minor burns, scrapes, bumps, bruises. Not very many of them talk about someone actually bleeding to death, which we do see on farms actually a fair amount. So there's a course called Stop the Bleed. It's a free course. The American College of Surgeons and a bunch of other agencies got together and developed it. You can take part of it online. So if you can't find anywhere to take it, you can always take the online version and at least watch the videos. That gives you a good start. But I would also recommend going and taking the hands-on section of it. That way you can learn. It talks about things like applying direct pressure to get bleeding stopped, and all the way up to applying tourniquets, which are something that you can use to stop bleeding. And to me, the Stop the Bleed course is more important in some ways than CPR, because with Stop the Bleed, you can save almost all of these patients. CPR, there's still a chance the patient won't survive. But with Stop the Bleed, if you can get bleeding, life-threatening bleeding stopped, that patient will survive. They go in, get some sutures, they close that wound up. There's a pretty good chance, almost 100%, that they're going to survive that injury. And most of the accidents we see on a farm are going to be trauma-related accidents. So I think it's super important. And along with that, for CPR, you really don't need a whole lot of equipment. Maybe a pair of gloves, but you don't even really have to have that. So there's not a whole lot of equipment to have on hand for CPR. Stop the Bleed, they make Stop the Bleed kits. So I'm not talking about your Band-Aids, ice pack, first aid kit you buy at Walmart. That's not the sort of thing we're talking about here. Those are good.
Not a scraper cut kit.
Right. No, those are good to have. That's probably what you'll use most of the time. But if someone's actually bleeding to death, a Stop the Bleed kit's the important thing to have. And usually they have things like gauze, and they might have a special type of gauze, something they call it a hemostatic gauze. It's got minerals or chemicals that are inside of the gauze that make your blood more likely to clot quickly. So this can be really important to have. And then the other big thing is a tourniquet. A lot of people have been told, we can't use tourniquets. You might lose that arm. That's not really something we worry about anymore. There's never been a case of someone losing a limb in a area within 4 or 5 hours of a hospital due to a tourniquet, but it can keep you from dying.
Right.
The other big thing is people say, I can improvise a tourniquet from a belt or a piece of rope, that sort of thing. Those really don't work very well. A real tourniquet is only about $30. I know that seems like a lot to have just on something you might never use, but it'd be a real shame to have someone you love bleed to death and you haven't spent the $30 beforehand for something that could have easily stopped it. So having CPR training, even if it's not a certification, just having the training, knowing not to stop that, Stop the Bleed course, and then a Stop the Bleed kit on every farm would be the biggest things I could think of.
Don't rely on podcasts alone to stay connected to Alabama's beef industry. Follow us at AL Cattlemen on Facebook and Instagram to get daily news and updates from the Alabama Cattlemen's Association.
Those are kind of the highlights that we wanted to hit today, just because those are the most common things that make a difference on these farming operations as people are doing their day-to-day activities. Obviously, we could spend hours talking about all the different little scenarios and things to be done, but those cover a lot of your major incidents that do happen.
There is one more thing I would mention, a little bit outside of the medical side, but more on, it's still definitely farm-related because we saw a case of this last week, is make sure all of your equipment has fire extinguishers on it. We had a gentleman who was out baling hay. He had a bearing freeze up in his baler, and it had some chaff and hay built up in the side, up next to the gearbox, and it set the field on fire. Because he had an extinguisher, he was able to put out the baler, so he saved his piece of equipment. And by the time we got there, it took us about 7 or 8 minutes from the time of the 911 call to get there. He'd lost probably half an acre to an acre But his baler didn't burn up and his tractor didn't burn up just because he was able to put that out around it. So with the fire extinguisher, you might not be able to stop the fire completely, but it can make a big difference in not only saving equipment, but that could have been his house nearby. It could have been somebody else nearby that they couldn't have moved. So I think that's a big thing to keep in mind as well.
And fire extinguishers are not that expensive. I think that's something that people forget going into some of these things. You know, as producers, we spend a lot of money on equipment maintenance and on insurance for different things, and this is an easy way for you to insure your property and caring for those you love in these emergency situations, is if you can have something to put it out early and take care of it quickly.
I feel like most farmers kind of lean towards the self-sufficient side. We like to handle things on our own. So having all that stuff there where you can at least minimize the damage, if not completely avoid the situation at all, is more valuable in a lot of cases than having the insurance to replace it if something were to happen.
And a lot less paperwork.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we've talked through a lot of those sorts of things of how to prepare, what to do in these cases. Is there any other information that you would like to share with these producers as they kind of think through this in their off season and think of different ways to be more on the proactive versus the reactive?
I think, as we mentioned earlier, kind of avoiding those situations is a big thing. Like I said, we all do high-risk things, whether that's in the course of work. You know, production's everything. We've got to be productive. We've got to be efficient. And sometimes that does lead to doing things not the safest way. And that, unfortunately, that's just how the whole world works, whether you're talking industry, farming, etc. But look at things that could cause you injury. You know, if you're out working on a side-by-side, it doesn't, or even a tractor with a ROP system, it doesn't take any extra time to put your seatbelt on. And if that thing rolls over and you have your seatbelt on, you're a lot less likely to be crushed by it or thrown off. Simple things like that. If you're working on an ATV or side-by-side, wear a helmet. You could still have the accident, you could still be really injured, but you're talking about decreasing the risk of a head injury, which, as I mentioned earlier, bleeding is the leading preventable cause of death and trauma. But head injuries are actually the leading cause of death and trauma. And the reason they're the leading cause of death and not preventable is once you have that head injury, there's not really a whole lot we can do. Even if you were inside of a hospital, you know, there's a lot of brain injuries that can't be repaired. So especially for kids who it's very easy to have them put on helmets before going out and doing these things. And even adults too. I know adults don't want to wear helmets as often, but that's one really good way to avoid injuries. And then just looking around at your operation, you know, is there a place I can reduce fire hazards? Keeping barns cleaned up, hay off the floor around ignition sources. Just look around at your farm and think what could go wrong and then try to mitigate those.
Absolutely. One other that I would mention in that kind of being proactive and looking around you is all of our producers are working with livestock at some point or another. And I know we know our cattle and we like to think that we know our cattle well and none of them would ever hurt us, but we also have to recognize on the grand scheme of things how much larger than us they are. We've had several producers over the past year that have been in livestock related accidents. So just being aware of your surroundings can do a lot for you, whether you're on a piece of equipment and you catch something early like smoke coming out of a baler, or paying attention to the livestock that you're working and kind of the situations that you put yourself in, making sure that you're never pinned up in a corner or in between panels and things like that. Just taking that additional second to look around you and prepare a little bit more and think through, what situation am I putting myself in? What could be the direct results of this, or other people as well. We've all been in that situation where someone has called us out and said like, hey, move out of the way. They're pulling this in here. Or look out for the crazy heifer that we're letting in the pen. But just making sure that you take the time to do that, because it's something that gets the best of all of us. You get comfortable, you get used to working in your fields and in the different parts of your operation and kind of forget to keep that watchful eye. So definitely be aware of what's going on around you. Before we wrap up the episode today, for anyone that has found this topic interesting or kind of maybe piqued their interest on being involved on a local level and maybe going through some of this training or those sorts of things, what are some resources that you can offer to them to go and find either the CPR training, the Stop the Bleed training, or to get involved locally to help look out for the people around them?
Sure. So for the CPR training, a couple of options there. The Red Cross and the American Heart Association are the two biggest agencies in the United States that do CPR training. The Stop the Bleed course, you can actually go online and just look up Stop the Bleed. Those are easy to find as well. If you want to do this on a more regular basis, provided that helps your community, or if you're just looking for these courses and are having a hard time finding them, reaching out to your local fire department. I know, like we said, most people are in a rural area, so they probably have a volunteer fire department. A lot of places also have volunteer ambulance services, so just reaching out to them, A lot of people worry that they're not trained as firefighters or trained as EMTs, and so will they take me to volunteer? Most of these places will take any volunteers and then provide the training after that. So if you wanted to become a certified firefighter or a certified EMT, they would put you through that training so you could help your community. And then if it's something that interests you as a career, longer term, a lot of those certifications are valuable to actually get into the career field. And it's a good career to do on the side with farming because of the schedule, right? So we work a lot of times 24-hour shifts and are off for several days. And so it's something that actually works really well with farming. Additionally, if you want to help your community, but you're not sure if you're up for being a firefighter or up to, you're squeamish with blood, something along those lines, these departments need help with driving. They need help with working on trucks. A lot of them have boards of directors that need volunteers. So just reach out to your local agencies and see if there's a way that you could help there.
I've definitely seen the community that these organizations build. They spend a lot of time working to improve the conditions of the communities that they're in. And so I definitely think it's a worthy cause to get involved in, regardless of the level that you're interested in. All right, cattlemen, y'all know what that sound means. It's time for your 3 fast facts before we go. Stemming from the conversation in this episode, I would like to remind all of you that we are currently wrapping up Farm Safety Week, which is always the 3rd week in September. So this is a great opportunity for you to make one improvement on your farm, whether that's something that we talked about today, like attending a CPR course or doing some Stop the Bleed training, or even putting in fire extinguishers in your tractors, or something a little bit easier like compiling some medical information about yourself and putting that somewhere where a first responder could find it. I highly encourage you to take the time to just think through this and find one improvement that you can make on your operation to better prepare yourself for any of these circumstances that we talked about. Another quick reminder, we have one more AJCA Fall Field Day and Judging Clinic, and that will be happening next week. So if you are listening to this podcast on the air date, today is your last day to register. This is a great opportunity to get your youth more involved in agriculture and give them the resources that they need to better be able to evaluate beef cattle and select those, whether they want to do that in competitions or just on the operation in a very practical sense. If you're interested in this program, you can find more information at www.bamabeef.org/fieldday. And the last fact before we go is something a little bit more about the association. So we discussed a lot about rural health in this episode, and that's something that we take very seriously. And one thing a lot of people probably don't know is here at the association, through the Alabama Cattlemen's Foundation, we have a scholarship for it. So it is called the Rural Medicine Scholarship, and that scholarship is available to medical students who are planning to practice medicine in rural Alabama after graduation. They can check out that information at bamabeef.org/scholarships, and those will open here shortly, so keep an eye out on our social media channels and all of our normal communication outreach methods for that information. Well, there you have it, folks. There are your 3 fast facts to take with you on the road as you go about the Alabama Cattlemen's Association. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and be sure to come back next week and every week for another great episode of the Cattle Connect podcast. Well, folks, thanks for tuning in to this episode of Cattle Connect, brought to you by the Alabama Cattlemen's Association. Be sure to subscribe to get notified when our next episode goes live. And until next time, remember, beef, it's what's for dinner.